Yeah. I'll let you know.
Okay.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to be very sparing with my voice today. I've got to sing, I've got to preach, and my voice doesn't want to cooperate today. So we'll see how that goes. Will that mean a shorter sermon? Probably not. But I'm glad to see everyone this morning. I know we have quite a few who are actually out traveling. We have one or two who's actually sick this morning, and we'll have some, as normal, be here during the time we're studying this morning. If you want to go ahead and open to lesson number 7 in the book, we're going to be going through the book of Ruth today. We're going to be looking at a couple of extensions of the biblical text. Something's not on. I know what it is. When Philip sung on Wednesday, I turned down the volume on my phone. I didn't want everybody to hear his wonderful voice. Okay, that's much better. No, I don't have to speak so loud. Okay, so we're in lesson 7 in the books today. We're going to be talking about Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. We're going to be looking at a couple of conditions that we seem to find in regards to families and how they kind of work with each other through different difficulties and trials that present themselves over time. I will make this announcement a little bit later on. Next quarter, from January to March, there's a sign-up list if any of the men want to teach a lesson. We're going through the minor prophets. I would honestly just want the Zechariah ones because, they're all interesting, but Zechariah is kind of a difficult book. But it goes through at least one chapter in each of the minor prophets. I think it'd be a good way of just getting our feet wet with teaching. So if you're interested, I've got the books if you want to start looking at stuff. But if you want to look at that and figure out what lesson you want to teach, that would be most appreciated. And we'll make that announcement again when we have more of the men here. Let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we will start with our lesson. Brother Jim. Amen. When we look through the Old Testament, there are 2 books in particular that do not mention God, or at least a certain aspect of God. One of those books is the book of Esther, where we see a young Jewish woman who is exalted by God through happenstance and time and building a relationship with others around her. God uses her to deliver His people. In the book of Ruth is another case where we find God using a woman and exalting her through a couple of, unique circumstances. We'll say that. As we look through the book of Ruth, what we're going to begin to see is that during a very difficult and trying time where most of Israel did not know how to follow God, there was one woman who did fear God. In fact, what's even more incredible about this woman, she was not a blood-born Jew. Now, what do I mean by blood-born Jew? Correct. She didn't come from one of the 12 tribes. We'll find out she did marry someone who was a Jew, and it could be the case that maybe she did proselytize or become a Jew through that practice, but we find through life's happenstances that her husband does pass away. And the book of Ruth is going to display that even someone who was not born into the Jewish religion, she trusted and confided in God so much that it shows through her care and consideration of how she treats her mother-in-law through these circumstances, but also how she ultimately respects God by honoring the law of marriage within the Jewish system, which is incredible, which goes to show that, maybe even the more faithful members of the bodies of Christ, if you recall Peter, they were dining at Peter's house, and this woman would just come in and start crying and weeping at the feet of Jesus. And it would tell us in the text that when the Pharisee saw this thing, he said within his heart, if Jesus really knew, if he knew what kind of manner of woman this was, he wouldn't have her do this. If he knew the past that she had and the sins that she had committed, he would not have her there. And Jesus already knew what was going on here. And Jesus would say to Peter, why are you thinking this? And in fact, he would even display a story about these two servants and a debtor, where one servant just owed like a minute amount to the master, but the other one owed like an outrageous amount to the servant. And the one who owed the outrageous amount really was the one who was the better of the two. In other words, Jesus would say at the end of that story, Peter, whom do you suppose, if the master forgave both of these servants their debts, who do you think was more appreciative or was extended more mercy? And Peter's answer would be the one who had a higher price. Well, what I see from that woman and Peter is that Jesus is telling Peter, it does not matter about this woman's past. What matters is she's going to do what's right. And she wants to follow God. And that's worth exalting. It doesn't matter about who they were, it's who they're trying to be. And when we look through the story of Ruth, considering she comes from a paganistic society, she displays more faithfulness and trust in the system of God and in the Jewish market, if you want to say that, than even some of God's own people. In fact, if you look at Ruth chapter 1 and verse number 1, it tells us, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. Well, if we're talking about the days of the judges, does anybody remember what phrase is always echoed throughout the book of Judges that talks about the moral character of God's people? Essentially, they had. The phrase is, everybody did what was right in his own eyes. In fact, notice the very last verse of the book of Judges. It begins with this idea in chapters 1 and 2 and 3, but then you look at the end, verse 25, chapter 21 of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, it wasn't the fact that there wasn't a king in Israel. The fact is that Israel wasn't allowing God to be whom God was to be. If you recall what God would say to Samuel, the people have not rejected you, Samuel, but rather they've rejected me from ruling over them. So the problem wasn't the matter of God was inadequate or God wasn't powerful enough, but throughout the book of Judges, we see this moral cycle where God's people become more and more separated from knowing what is right and wrong. They did not exalt God as king of their life. They didn't exalt God as where they should have put him. Bless you. But what we do find is that what they were doing was they were living by a subjective law. So if I think something's right or I think something's wrong, I'm going to act by that, regardless what God's word says, because, well, my experience tells me that this is the right way, or I just think that it should be like this and not like what I find in the law. That is dangerous territory. Now, when God's people are in this kind of mindset, which, by the way, that is exactly where we are in America. We like to live by subjective laws. We don't like to be told what to do. And if you were to tell the masses of the community what God is to say, you're probably going to get a lot of varying views. One in particular that seems to be just an issue today was social recreational drinking. They recently did a program with that at the school. But there's a lot of people who advocate, who are Christians, who advocate that it is okay. And they throw out the medicinal aspect, but they turn something that's an absolute through Scripture, and they turn it into a subjective opinion, which that's not the case. God's people did the same thing, not just on those kind of matters, but on marriage and also in positions of authority, and even judges themselves taking bribes from communities of pagans who God said, you're supposed to destroy these people. They are not supposed to be here. So when I look at the beginning of Ruth, Verse 1 is telling me we are looking at a moral decline within God's own people, which should not have been the case, but that's where they were. So if Israel as a whole was on a complete moral decline, then what I should read through the book of Ruth, if she just simply said, well, everybody else is doing it, therefore I have to as well, I don't think she ever would have married Boaz. She would have gone back home. She would not have really cared that much about Naomi. I mean, it would have been like, well, it was great while it lasted. We'll see you later. And then Ruth goes on home. She doesn't do that. So in the very first verse, I'm looking at a contrast of a complete moral deficiency of Israel themselves. And then it makes mention of a man who went to go marry a woman. Notice with me Ruth chapter 1, and we'll just read through the beginning portion of the text to set where we need to be. It came to pass when the judges ruled, in the days when the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Amalek, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Now I want to pause right here before we get into a different thought with this. If we're looking at the days of the judges, what had just happened before we even get into the book of Judges? So in Israel's history, before God appointed judges to help deliver them from some of the inhabitants that they had spared within the land, what major event had just transpired in the 7 years before the beginning of Judges? So they came out of Egypt. They're in the wilderness. Now we're in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. What happens in Joshua? They go into the land conquest. It takes 7 years for them to take over all the land. They have had this great victory from God. In fact, if you notice in chapter 21, beginning in about verse 43 to the end of the chapter in Joshua, it would say that the Lord had fulfilled his promise. All that God had commanded Joshua and the children of Israel, he fulfilled the land promise. Everything that had been given from the land promise in Genesis 12, 15, 17, 22, 36, and also 48 and 49 and 50. All of those texts would say that when God would visit his people and he would ultimately give that land to them, that this was to represent that God kept his promise. Hence, it's called the Ark of the Covenant, an Ark of the Testimony. Covenant represents there's 2 parties who make a pact. Testimony means that one has a message, and if you keep this message, then you'll get this. If you don't keep this message, you get this. Well, when God's people took over the land, they had this great military conquest. Now, imagine this. Your family has spent hundreds of years waiting for the fulfillment of this promise. At least 430 from the giving of the promise to Genesis 12 to Exodus 20, and then you have another 40 years that transpire until you get into the land, and then you've got 7 years. So you got 477 years from Genesis 12 to Joshua 21. And within that time period, God finally gives your family the land. And then somehow, after that time, you say, well, that was a good land while it lasted. Let's go somewhere else. I don't think this promised land is what it's all made out to be. What does that display about your trust or faith in God? Don't have it. Now, what the text doesn't say, and I think there's a devil advocate thought to that, maybe there was something that happened during this time. And I think it might have been famine. Notice what Naomi would say to Ruth and her other daughter-in-law about the land during that time of the Judges, because you've got all this moral decline through the book of Judges. He would say in verse number 6, they had heard that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. What does it sound like was going on in the land of Palestine? Why would you give bread to a whole nation? They were starving. What causes lack of produce and crops in a land? Lack of rain. Could be lack of grain. Famine. Famine in the land. You look throughout Genesis, you'll find through the story of Abraham, multiple times they either went to the land of Egypt or they went to a different land moving across Palestine because there was a famine in the land. The second time God told Abraham, do not go back to Egypt. Don't do it. Same thing with Isaac in chapter 26 when we see his story with Abimelech, where he goes to the Philistines and there's a famine in the land. And for some reason, Ishmael or Isaac and his family are being blessed, but Abimelech and his nation, the Philistines, aren't being blessed. It could be that maybe there was a famine in the land. Now, was it a lack of faith? I don't know, but I think it displays that idea a little bit. But based off the consideration, they're looking at their physical surroundings, and they're making their choices based off these conditions of what they're going through. Now, it's admirable, we find that both Ruth and the other daughter-in-law, I just lost her name. Orpah, yes. Oh, they're in the crevice of my Bible, verse 4. Orpah and Ruth, it is commendable that they begin to travel with their mother-in-law. All of their husbands have passed away. By law, they technically could go out and do whatever they want. In fact, if they're in the land of Moab, what is probably at a premium low because they're among the Moabites. What kind of law were they following as the Moabite people? Were they following the law of Moses or the law of the land? Law of the land. Moabites were not part of the Jews. They were an extended nation with their own law system, but they were not God's people. And these are not one of those nations that we read about through Nehemiah and also Deuteronomy, where the children of Israel could not worship or could not marry these particular people. They could. There was nothing wrong with that. But what I do find, despite all this, by law, they could have gone somewhere else, but they decide to stay with Naomi. Now, notice as we begin to tune in on the main focus character of the book of Ruth, it would say, verse number 9, the Lord grants you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them. They lift up their voices and wept. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. Now, one time, because they say we don't want to separate from each other, we want to stay with you. Naomi responds, first response, 11. Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, will you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourself from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So they lifted up their voices, they wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Now, when Naomi sees this, notice her response in verse 15, but then I want to look even more carefully at Ruth's response to Naomi. First time we're introduced to the character of Ruth, not by name, but by her speech. Notice verse 15. Naomi responds, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." In other words, paraphrase, I want you to look at where the majority influence has taken your sister-in-law. She listened to what I said. Follow after her example. I want you to consider, again, the family history. In the time when Israel was in moral decline, everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. Did God tell them to go to the land of Moab? Did they decide to go to the land of Moab because there was a famine and they just couldn't make ends meet? I don't know. It's possible. But what I do find is that Ruth was not an individual who compromised based on what the majority said and or what loved ones did or said. Now, if it's her sister-in-law, she probably spent a lot of time with her. Lots of times. They're in the same family. Think in ancient societies, you would have the head of the household, and that head of the household would have this distribution of property. But in order for the sons within that family to receive that inheritance, they had to stay and work within the confines of whatever the property was for the father. So if he had two sons, there was a possibility the second born was saying, "Oh man, I got a possibility of getting an inheritance. Maybe my brother will pass away and I'll have to take up the inheritance mantle." That's possible. But I don't think they all expected that all three of them would pass away so soon next to each other. Because there was no more sons, no more inheritance, and the families had stuck together for so long, I want you to notice what Ruth would say. And I want us to really break this apart just a little bit before we jump over to the second half of this. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. And the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." I want you to notice that even amongst the emotionalism, ladies, I can't really relate to this because I'm not a lady, but I have experienced emotions, so I kind of get it. When Ruth's mother-in-law is weeping, and all three of them are crying together, and Naomi is pleading with them, "Look, even if you wait for a child from me, I got to find a husband first." And even that process is going to take some time. And even by the time they get old enough to get married, you're going to be up in your 50s, your 60s. There's a possibility you may not be able to bear children if you wait that long. Ruth's love was not about, "I need children." Ruth's love was not about that there's all this inheritance. She is simply concerned about another person. That's it. If you consider your relationships that you build with people, through Galatians 3 and 4, 2 Corinthians 6, 7, Hebrews 10, Ephesians 3 and 4, Colossians 3. There's a host of other passages. Sometimes people only build connections because you have something and they want it. And they only build that relationship because you have that thing. Have you found it interesting that you'll have someone with a lot of fame or athletic ability or talent in some regard, and when something happens where they can't do that thing that everybody praises them for, what happens to all their friends? Disappear. Ruth is a display towards Naomi. It's not about the physical possessions. It's about the relationships. In fact, I even give praise to Ruth's husband. when I consider the words that she says, something about that marriage relationship had to influence Ruth to such a degree that she begs beyond the emotionalism of the situation, which is difficult at times to think logically through. She says, don't beg me to leave you. Don't beg me to turn back. Don't beg me to follow the influence of others. I will make my own choice. Listen to her choice very carefully. This is paraphrased. I will go with you to take care of you. I will worship the God that I know that you worship. She doesn't say this, but this is by implication. That is the God my husband taught me to worship. This is the same God who would not leave his people in times past. This is the same God who went with his people through the wilderness. This is the same God who showed many signs and wonders and miracles, even despite the statement made in verse number 6, the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Well, he's done that before. Go back to Exodus 16 and 17. God gave his people manna. God gave his people quail. All those 40 years, God provided them manna. Hence, we find that statement Jesus would make in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Ruth wasn't concerned about where the majority influence was. She was considering historically the providence and the promises of God. God had always taken care of his people, and he kept those families together. Now, it could be the case that maybe Ruth had reasoned this. You know, if you had more than just Joshua and Caleb, if you had families who trusted in God, and there would have been some families in Numbers 13 who would have chosen to do the right thing, not by looking at the appearance of things, but trusting that God would give them deliverance, then maybe there could have been more families saved and more families going to the promised land because they simply trusted in God. They followed after God. After all that God had done for them, why would he turn his back on them now? That's probably the same kind of character I find from Ruth. All throughout the book, I find that even when she's in a field working with young men, she has no interest in the young men because by implication, her actions show this. These young guys are immature. They're all looking at the physical beauty. And Ruth is simply trying to be a servant. And during the book, we begin to find out that Boaz is an extended family member. And she even talks to Ruth, and even Boaz makes this claim. You know, most women your age, if not all women your age, would try to find a spouse that's around their age because they kind of think the same. I would say they're in the same maturity level, but you've experienced enough people through your lifetime. A man and woman can be the same age, but it might be different maturity levels. It just depends, especially when they're both one. The maturity is pretty low at that point. But despite that, Ruth wasn't interested in the youthfulness. She wasn't interested in what the majority was going after. She wasn't even interested with people that she had been around for so long. If they chose to do something that was contrary to or opposite to what God had taught his people in times past, in those moral lessons that were taught about faithfulness through trying times and sticking together to see things out because there's a light at the end of the tunnel, Ruth at least shows the example that the God that you worship is the same God I want to worship because he has never left or forsaken you. Therefore, I will try to be like God and not leave or forsake you. If anything's ever going to separate us, Naomi, it's going to be death. And even death, there will be a reunion too. Now you think of, again, this was not a blood-born Jew. This was a woman who was a pagan, who because of godly influences, won her over to the Lord to such a greater extent than those who had grown up under the law. So when I look at a time of moral disarray and everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes, I know there's one person who wasn't, and that was Ruth. So when I consider her position, you could have children, you could have an inheritance, you could have all these things if you just go back to the land. I don't need the land. I just need your God because your God has done so much. That's what I want. When I consider how this expands into the rest of the text, we begin to find out, verse 20 and following, that there is an extended family. And they make that journey. The book talks about this. That probably was a 1-week journey, about 70 to 200 miles, depending on which route they took. I don't know if you've ever said, let's go for a scenic drive, and you decide to take the short route. It's normally not how it goes. But regardless of how long the journey was, you have 2 women, just 2 women, going by themselves in the wilderness. I want you to think about the dangers of that. Night and day, by themselves, no other men around, at least not any to help caravan or protect them on their journey. Why would you send 2 widowed women, one young, one old, out into the wilderness? I think this is another example of God's providence. Nobody touched them on that journey. Not a one. Now, that doesn't mean that you can test whether or not God will protect you by going to run in the streets by yourself at night. That's not what that text teaches. But I do see that Ruth's dependence on Naomi, more primary, Naomi's God. Ruth realized, if that's the God you serve and he did all these things, maybe he can still do something in my life. Do you think maybe someone told Ruth about the story of Joseph? What's so unique about the beginning of Joseph's story? I know we're introduced to him when he's 17 years old, but next time his age is mentioned, does anybody know how old he was when he was thrown in prison? And then he spoke to Pharaoh. He would have been about 30 to 32 years old. And the text tells us that. You have a 30 to 32-year-old man who spent 13 to 15 years apart from his family, betrayed by his brothers, serving as a slave. And the text still tells us that even amongst all these things against Joseph, God still blessed him. I think someone told Ruth about that story. These are not ideal circumstances. These are not ideal times. But the same God who took a young man and made him second in command over all the land and gave him a family and brought his family back to him could be the possible thinking of Ruth. That same God can also help me. I've lost my husband. I'm now learning about this God who's done incredible things for his people in times past. What could God do for me if I fear him and I try to go through this process of grief and trying to navigate through these new conditions of life? Can God bless me? Oh, he does. He does. And this is where our book takes us to the end of the book. As Naomi finds out that Boaz is a near kinsman to the family, he would be a cousin to the family. We do find out that he does decide, based on Ruth's actions, she does do a proposal of sorts when we see chapter 3. That when she lays down at the feet of Boaz in it's just a room. When she does that act, it was to display that she did find interest in Boaz. In other words, she was proposing to Boaz, will you marry me? Hence, he was aghast when he saw her, and then he thought, did something happen where I blacked out and we did something that I didn't know? And Ruth says, no. Nothing happened. Now, in her society, if you look at Deuteronomy, it would imply that the Moabites and the Ammonites were engaged in just fornication all the time, all the time. You would have parents who would give their children up to other people because it was a service to their God. So those parents would be advocating for their sons and daughters to freely sin and abuse their body, and some of them would eventually become prostitutes, which God would say through Leviticus and Numbers. You are not to do that with your daughters. You are not to do that with your sons. You're not to give them over to sin or put sin in their way. They are to be holy. They are to be pure. Ruth wasn't like that. Again, because of her fear for God, she also recognized through the teaching of the law, there was a manner by which women can adorn themselves with godliness. Now, here's what I begin to find. And it makes sense when I read Ruth and Boaz's story, but it doesn't make sense when I'm a young guy until I get older. Why is it that older people have a greater appreciation for God most of the time? So older. Most of you have already undergone Ecclesiastes. You're getting towards the end of the book. Some of us, chapter 11, some chapter 12. Now, I'm not talking about verse 6 to 11 or the beginning of chapter 12. That would fit some of us. But I do want you to recognize when you look around the church, you mostly see old people. Who told the young person that you're guaranteed 70 years, 60, 50, 40, 30? Just saw on the news yesterday, a boy was riding to school with his stepfather, and there was some kind of road rage, and the driver shot a gun backwards, killed the kid. Who told people you get to live forever? And what arrogance do we ever think that we shouldn't learn to appreciate and love God in our younger years and wait till we're much older? I want you to think about if you don't desire to serve or fear God until you're in your 60s or 70s. I want you to think about the damage you've been doing for the past 50, 60 years prior in your life. How many people could actually have a better chance to go to heaven because you took God seriously much, much earlier in life? Even when we get later in life and we find ourselves having a relapse of sort. Why would we do that considering how many people are going to be lost at the end of the world? What if we could actually make a difference where we are? It's still going to be few are going to find it and many are going to be lost, but there's going to be less lost in the many because we took God seriously earlier. Ruth is an example of what it looks like to fear God, even in the prime of life, even when you have the physical appearance and the beauty, you've got the knowledge and intellect what to do, but she shows honor, respect, reverence to God, and in doing so, she lives her life and presents her life with all purity and holiness. That's not something I get as a young child because I'm naive. I don't learn those things, which is all the more reason. Titus chapter 2, older men teach the younger men. Older women teach the younger women. That's all things that God has taught us to be. Young people need to see experience at a young age. That's why if you take a person through Ecclesiastes and they take that to heart, they will have a different outlook on life because they're not looking at life through the limited young person's scope. I gasp and I don't get it. I'm dumb. I'm still dumb. But Ethan 15 years ago was an idiot compared to Ethan today, and he's not that far off from there now. But it was because of the things of ignorance and a lack of looking at the reality of things that Ethan thought the world was a different place. And it was not. And you know what? Who's always been wrong? Every time he reflects on the ultimate scheme of life, I have. You know who's always been right and never once done me wrong. And everything he said has always happened. God. Who told Ruth that? Her husband? Her mother-in-law? Could have been her father-in-law. I don't know. But what I do find is that Ruth, again, is not being influenced by the world around her. She is choosing to live holy and righteously in that present age, regardless of what everybody else says and what they think. Hence, I find when Boaz makes the agreement in chapter 3 and 4 that he was going to try to make things right. Verse 5 to 12 of chapter 4. This is where, well, we'll talk about a concept here in a second. This is where I begin to find that Boaz goes down and he finally seals the deal. He redeems Ruth and Naomi. Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you may also, or must also, buy it from Ruth the Moabitess. This is Boaz talking to the one who rightfully should have carried on the family name. And it would say, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. Now the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. In other words, I already have a promise that's been given to me. I already have a land that's already been given to me, along with all this livestock and everything. If I marry Naomi and Ruth, I'm going to lose it all. In other words, if I do what the law of God commands me to do, and I think the book brings this out, Deuteronomy 25, I believe is the passage that it presents. Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. It does talk about that if a man does die, and we see this also in Genesis chapter 38, I believe, with Judah and Tamar, but the law of Moses had not been written yet. But there was, in a sense, a law where one who was married, if he were to die, that the brother was to carry on the family name by providing a seed for the daughter. Now, again, that is Old Testament law. That is not a New Testament law. There's something different in place today. But I find that when the close relative says, I'm going to ruin my inheritance if I try to live up to the law. Can you imagine that? I already have all this stuff. If I honor God now, consider what all I'm going to lose. Ruth's perspective. If I follow God now, think of all the things I can gain. Verse number 7. Now this was the custom in foreign times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm anything. One man took off his sandal, gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witness this day that I bought all that was Elimelech's, and all that was Chilion's, and more that was Mahlon's, from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired his wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses these days. I want you to think of two sub-lessons we can take from this. One immediate, one not so. When I look at this in the ultimate scheme of things, Ruth and Boaz had a child by the name of Obed. And Obed had a son by the name of Jesse. And Jesse had a number of sons, one of which was the greatest king in all of Israel, David. Do you think Ruth would have ever imagined that because of her faithfulness, that God would choose her to ultimately bring about the seed by which Jesus would sit upon that throne line forever? Not in her wildest dreams. Did you know that Jesus has passed on? He died. He's back in heaven. Do you know in Ephesians 5 it would say that God has left for us his bride? Who's going to carry on the dead man's name? Who's going to carry on his lineage? He's allowed us to care for Christ's greatest love, his wife, the church. And if we fail to take care of what he has entrusted in our hands, and we say, no, everything that I built for myself, my reputation, my name, all my property, all this stuff that I've gotten, because I've not feared or followed God, I'm going to lose all that. Who cares? A young pagan woman said, if God can do all this in the past, think of what God can do for me in the future. I can only think through possibilities. And then when she finally got to experience the blessings, isn't that the same kind of lesson that maybe Ruth can teach us if we live like Ruth did? Fear God, keep his commandments. That is our whole duty. God can bless us so much more than we could think or imagine. But we've got to put him first beyond all worldly influences, family influences, internal desires, and have a passion to simply and want to only follow God till death rejoin us. Thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back for worship here in about 15 minutes.